Hey guys, Sir Launcelot. The idea of the round table caught on among the ambitious young men everywhere. They came flocking to Camelot from the east and the west to be King Arthur's knights. Among those who came from France was one who was destined to become the most famous of all King Arthur's knights. His name was Galahad Lancelot du Lac. Word of the Round Table had come to the young Lancelot, and after that he could think of nothing but how he might become a member of that fellowship. Through the years of his boyhood, he practiced at tilting and jousting and fencing and every one of the knightly skills until he was adept at them all. At last, he was able to realize his dream and make his way to King Arthur's court. Um, Rise, Sir Launcelot, said Arthur, and the young man who had knelt to be knighted got to his feet. He and Arthur looked at each other a moment, and in the time that they looked, each knew that they were born to be friends. "Come," Arthur said, "let me take you to meet. Let me take you to meet Guinevere." He clapped his hand on Lancelot's shoulder and led the way down the long corridor, hung with tapestries, to the sunny rooms at the back of the castle where Guinevere and her ladies liked to sit at their sewing and weaving. As Guinevere looked full into Lancelot's eyes, and he looked into hers. Their gazes locked, and a strange shock went through them both. Perhaps he did have a rough, craggy face. If so, it made no difference to Guinevere, just as Arthur and Lancelot had looked at each other and recognized that they were friends. Now, Guinevere and Lancelot recognized something else, an electric connection between them that seemed to keep their eyes and hands fused together. They loved each other purely and happily. Lancelot was content to ride in the jousts and tourneys which Arthur was holding day after day. It was happiness for him to ride at his opponent, his spear feuded, and then to unhorse him in one charge. And all the while, Guinevere would be smiling her admiration. The electricity tingled between him and her, but they enjoyed it innocently. The time eventually came for Lancelot to go off on his year of questing. He took leave of Arthur, and Lancelot kissed Guinevere's hand and looked into her eyes for another of those shaking moments. Then they clambered onto their horses. No knight clothed in heavy armor was able to leap onto a horse, and off they went. One day, while questing, Lancelot came to a village clustered around a castle on the hill. The villagers recognized him at once and began telling him that he was the one who could save a damsel and could perform a miracle. It took a while for Lancelot to find out what they were talking about, but finally he got the story. The daughter of King Pelles, who lived in the castle up on the hill, had been fearfully magic some years before, so that she had to spend all her days and nights in a vat of boiling water. Various people, including some of King Arthur's knights, had tried to pull her out, but without any success. Lancelot moved doubtfully toward the tub. "Just take my hand," said the maiden. "If you are the one, then that is all that is needed." Lancelot put out his hand, the maiden took it, and lo, it was a miracle. She stood up and stepped out of the tub, rosy red as she was. Lancelot could see that she was a very pretty girl. Well, the name of this maiden who was rescued was Elaine, and in later centuries, poet would write about her. She was Elaine the fair, Elaine the lovable, Elaine the lily maid of Astolat. And in another poem, she was called the Lady of Shalott, though many people think the name of the town where she lived was Corbin. At any rate, all the poems tell of how Elaine fell in love with Sir Launcelot. And of course, that was exactly what Elaine, daughter of King Pelles, did. She fell totally in love with the knight who had rescued her from her watery misery. Soon enough, she discovered that all his love was given to somebody else. He might admire her and say pleasant things about her beauty, but he stayed as placid and distant as an uncle. Elaine was a single minded girl. There she was, rescued from the water and restored to happy everyday life. Again, sunshine and dry clothes, but all she wanted was Sir Launcelot. The nurse who had raised her after her mother's death, Dame Bryson, who knew a good bit of magic herself, found Elaine crying in her room, and very soon she learned the reason for the tears. That night, Lancelot drank wine with King Pelles at dinner. After the king had retired, he continued to drink, which wasn't like him. Then the messenger came to the castle with a note for him. It was from Guinevere. If Lancelot had not been so befuddled with wine and whatever Dame Bryson had added to it, he might have wondered a little. In all the months he and Guinevere had loved each other, she had never written to him. Now he was miles from Camelot, and how did she know he was in King Pelles' castle? However, here was a note from her saying that she was staying in a castle nearby. Arthur was off on some business of the kingdom. She was lonely. All sorts of sunbursts and starbursts went off in Lancelot's mind, and he never stopped to think about any of the queerness of it. He ran for his fur mantle. He followed the messenger out of the castle, found his horse, and then rode along with the messenger to a small castle. There he dismounted and followed the messenger, who led him to a great dark room where it seemed to Lancelot that his one love, his dear love, was waiting for him. In the dawn he awoke feeling sick. He thought, I have betrayed my dear friend Arthur. How can I live with myself after this? I have lost forever the right to be the best knight in the kingdom. He rose from the bed and went to push aside the great tapestries that covered the window. He unlatched the window and pushed it open. The cool morning air rushed in, and as it flowed about him, his enchantment vanished. He looked over to the great bed and saw not Guinevere, his dear love, but the rosy, curly haired maiden he had rescued from the tub. For a moment he wanted to kill her. His hand reached out, tempting for the sword that would end this wicked creature that had caused him to betray not only Arthur, but Guinevere also. How could you? He croaked. How could you? I love you, Elaine whispered. She began to cry. I wanted you and your baby more than anything. Naturally, Lancelot did not kill this weeping child. He pulled himself together, put on his clothes, and even forced himself to pat her hand before he left the castle. He roamed about the countryside for many days. After that, it seemed ages ago that he had felt especially blessed from being allowed to work the miracle for Elaine. Now he could think only Now he could only think that though his sin he had forfeited everything. Arthur's friendship and Guinevere's love. But finally, as sinful and as unworthy as he felt, he made his way back to Camelot, only to learn that Arthur and his knights were getting ready to go to France to aid Lancelot's father, King Ban of Benwick, who was engaged in a war with King Claudius. Of course, Lancelot wished to go, but Arthur requested that he remain in England to protect Arthur's kingdom. And so it befell that Arthur and many of his knights left for Ban's kingdom in France. Guinevere and Lancelot were left, certainly not alone at Camelot, but with no one in particular paying much attention to what they did. If Lancelot had not felt that he had already sinned and lost his right to be the best knight in the world, perhaps it would have been a longer time before they came together. But sooner or later it would have happened, and happened it did. It was the first inkling of the shadow that Merlin had seen when he tried to warn Arthur against Guinevere. For Guinevere and Lancelot there was no hint of a shadow. They had a year of joy. There was still not a hint of shadow or trouble when Arthur returned at last with his knights from France. He was delighted to be home and full of stories about the battles by which he and King Ban had finally defeated King Coludus. But when King Ban arrived at the castle to celebrate the victory, he brought news that Elaine had given birth to a fine son whom she had named Galahad. Most people at Camelot knew that Lancelot's first name was Galahad. They knew that Lancelot had been at Elaine's father's castle, and had worked a miracle for her. But this was not quite the miracle they had imagined. There was a great deal of quiet laughter in the court, but no laughter at all when Guinevere and Lancelot were finally alone together. "So," said Guinevere in a strange voice that hissed through their teeth, "this is why you came to me at last. You said you were giving up your purity for me. Instead, Lancelot tried to explain to her how he had been magicked into thinking he was meeting her that night when he had been taken to Elaine. For a long time, Guinevere would not listen, but at last she gave in and they clung to each other, and all was well again, but not for long. Elaine, back home in her father's castle in Corbin, crooned over her baby and thought of Sir Launcelot. She brooded because he never came to see her or the child, and then she decided that she would go to him at Camelot along with the baby. Her father assisted her in doing so, and she set off in great state, carrying the baby like an offering. 20 knights and 10 ladies came with her. Of course, King Arthur greeted her with all courtesy. Guinevere swallowed hard, and she was too made the young woman welcome, though she did not look much at the child. All the knights who were not out questing were quite dazzled at Elaine's beauty. Lost my place and saluted her. Only Lancelot stayed in the shadows and took no part in the greetings. Later, Guinevere sought him out. She was feeling terrible pangs of jealousy because of the baby, and she said, "I suppose you will go to her tonight." But he assured her that would never happen and reminded her that he only went to Elaine before because he was tricked and bewitched. He told him that she gave Elaine a room close to her own, and then simply turned and walked away. As hard as it may be to believe, it did happen again. Dame Bryson found Elaine crying in her room because Lancelot had not spoken one word to her. Bryson said, "Stop your crying, my pretty. Your love will be with you tonight." Late in the night, Dame Bryson went to Lancelot's room and whispered that Guinevere was waiting for him, and he, dope by whatever magic she had fed him, followed her, thinking he was going to his own dear love. He was back in his own room before dawn and had no notion that he had been bewitched until Guinevere called him and Elaine to her the next morning. The queen's face was pale and she was clenching and unclenching her hands. She gasped as she spoke. "False knight, false and traitorous, and in my own court too." Lancelot was bewildered. Then he looked at Elaine, who was looking at the floor but smiling self-consciously. "No, not," he cried. "Not for my own will. I was bewitched." Um, the same story all over again. I was a fool to believe it the first time. Go, go, and I never want to see you again, Guinevere said. Lancelot tried to speak, but his words seemed clouded in his mouth. He stretched out his arms. He fell on his knees. Then suddenly he was clutching his head in a sort of frenzy. He ran across the room to a window that overlooked the courtyard. With one leap, he cleared the sill and jumped out onto the ground below. Then he ran like a wild man across the yard and out of the gate over the bridge and on. No one knew where. For 2 years Lancelot ran a wild wood, and no one knew him. Clad in a ragged shirt and breeches, he lived on the fruits and nuts of the forest and drank water from the streams. He grew gaunt and his eyes had a red glare. Although he was living in the wilderness, he was still a knight, and he could not rest forever without using his knightly skills. He had heard of a tourney that was taking place nearby and sent a messenger to invite the participants to a joust. Eventually, Lancelot ended up living outside of the village, which was part of King Pelias's kingdom. When Elaine learned of this, she sent for him, and although he was not happy about it, her father provided a small castle for them to live as a family. He raised his son, who would eventually become Sir Galahad, the greatest knight of all time, who would sit at the round table in the Siege Perilous, the one seat reserved for the perfect knight. But that too is another